Hello, dear readers. Before we embark on this journey back to ancient Egypt, I'd love to connect with you. How has your day been treating you? What time is it where you are in the world right now? Are you reading this as the sun rises over your morning coffee? Or perhaps as evening shadows lengthen across your home? I'm always fascinated to think about how our stories travel across time zones and continents, bringing us together through shared curiosity about the past. Whether you're joining us from bustling New York, quiet countryside in England, the vibrant cities of Australia, or anywhere else our tales might reach, welcome. If you're enjoying these glimpses into history, please consider subscribing to History Tales. Your support helps us continue uncovering these human stories that remind us how little has truly changed about the heart, even across millennia. Now let us step back over 3,000 years to the banks of the mighty Nile, where love bloomed just as sweetly as it does today. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Thebes as Layat made her way to the market. A bundle of freshly woven linen balanced gracefully on her head. The year was 1300 BCE, and Pharaoh Seti I ruled from his magnificent palace, though his influence felt distant here among the common folk who worked with their hands and lived by the rhythm of the Nile's floods. Layat was 19, with dark eyes that sparkled with intelligence and calloused fingers that spoke of countless hours at the loom. Her father, Amenhotep, was known throughout their quarter as one of the finest linen weavers in Thebes, and Layat had inherited both his skill and artistic eye. She found her usual spot near the fountain, where she spread a reed mat and arranged her wares. The indigo cloth she had woven with precious dye would make magnificent offering cloths for the upcoming festival of Hathor. It was then that she first felt eyes upon her. Across the square, near the scribe's stall, a young man had paused in his examination of writing materials. Kemen was 22, tall and lean, with the careful posture of one who spent his days bent over scrolls. His white linen kilt was clean and well maintained, marking him as someone with steady work, and the leather satchel across his shoulder bore the seal of the Temple of Amun. He had noticed Layat before. Her laughter carried like music across the square, and her skill as a weaver had earned her a reputation. But until this moment, watching her arrange her fabrics with such artistry, he had never found the courage to approach her. The morning passed in a dance of glances. When their eyes finally met across the crowded square, both looked away quickly, but not before each had seen the other's smile. It was Layat's younger brother, Katie, who finally broke the spell. The 12-year-old boy nearly collided with Kemen, who was so distracted he hadn't been watching where he walked. "You're Layat's brother," Kemen said, recognising the same warm brown eyes. Katie grinned. "Everyone knows Layat. She weaves the most beautiful cloth in all of Thebes." Here was opportunity. Kemen reached into his satchel and withdrew a small roll of papyrus. With quick strokes he wrote a message in flowing hieratic script. "To the daughter of Amenhotep, whose fingers create beauty from simple threads, whose smile brightens the market square more than the morning sun. This humble scribe would speak with you of more than cloth, if you would permit it." He sealed it with wax and his personal seal, a reed pen crossed with a lotus flower. "Would you deliver this to your sister?" he asked Katie, pressing a copper coin into the boy's palm. That evening, as the family gathered for their meal, Layat showed the message to her parents. Her mother, Nefertiti, examined the papyrus approvingly. "The handwriting is excellent," she noted, "and the papyrus is of good quality, not something a poor man could afford to waste on casual flirtation." Her father, Amenhotep, was more practical. A temple scribe earns steady wages, but what do we know of his character? "Tomorrow you will make inquiries about this young man," Nefertiti told Katie. "Learn what you can about his reputation and family." As Layat lay on her sleeping mat that night, she thought about the message hidden beneath her pillow. Tomorrow she would craft a reply, but tonight she would dream of a young scribe whose words painted pictures more beautiful than any fabric she had ever woven. 3 days later, Layat sent her carefully composed reply to the scribe whose words flowed like the Nile in flood season, bringing life to dry places. Your message was received with favour. If your intentions are honourable, my family would welcome a proper introduction. Katie had completed his investigations and reported that Kemen was well regarded at the temple, known for his honesty and skill. His father is a boat builder who supplies vessels to the Royal Navy, the boy told his parents. He's never been married, though several families have approached his parents with proposals. When Kemen received Layat's reply, he knew the time had come for formal courtship. He requested leave from the temple and made his way to the finest merchants. Perfume held special significance in Egyptian courtship. To give it was to acknowledge a woman's beauty and offer something precious. The perfume maker, an elderly woman named Iset, greeted him with knowing eyes. "You have the look of a man in love," she said. "What scent would speak to your beloved's heart?" Kemen thought of Layat's grace and artistry, something that speaks of creativity, of beauty growing from simple things. Iset blended lotus, jasmine and myrrh, a complex scent that would unfold throughout the day, like a well-crafted poem. Next, Kemen purchased pomegranate wine and a beautifully carved reed pen fitted with a bronze nib. That afternoon, dressed in his finest white linen and wearing his grandfather's collar of blue beads, Kemen made his way to Layat's home with a fellow scribe as witness. Amenhotep emerged, followed by his wife and daughter. Layat wore a sheath dress of fine white linen she had woven herself, with a broad collar of colourful beads and lotus flowers in her hair. Kemen bowed respectfully. "Honoured weaver, I am Kemen, son of Sekhmet, the boat builder of Memphis, keeper of records at the Temple of Amun. I come seeking the privilege of courting your daughter Layat." They settled on reed mats under the lean-to, where Nefertiti served bread, dates and beer. Kemen presented his gifts with ceremony. "The perfume is blended with lotus, sacred to Hathor," he said, offering the clay vessel to Layat. "May it remind you that some things grow more beautiful with time." The pomegranate wine drew approving nods. It spoke of serious intentions, but the reed pen truly impressed Amenhotep. "You honour our family by assuming we value learning," the weaver said. "Any children born to your daughter should be able to read the wisdom of our ancestors," Kemen replied. As the afternoon progressed, the conversation revealed Kemen's intelligence and gentle humour, while Layat's occasional comments showed her own wit and wisdom. When the visit concluded, Nefertiti took Kemen aside. "My daughter has refused 3 other suitors. What makes you think you can win her heart?" Kemen looked at Layat, who was showing his reed pen to her brother. "I don't know if I can win her heart, honoured mother, but I hope to prove myself worthy of the chance to try." As he prepared to leave, Layat approached with a small gift, a square of linen so finely woven it was almost transparent, embroidered with lotus flowers in blue thread. "For your writing materials," she said, "to keep your papyrus clean and your reed pens protected." It was simple, but had required hours of work. More importantly, it showed she had been thinking of him. That evening both families discussed the day's events with satisfaction. Kemen had proven respectful, intelligent, and genuinely interested in Layat herself, not just making a practical match. For 7 days, Kemen came to share the evening meal with Layat's family, allowing both to observe their compatibility while maintaining proper supervision. Each evening brought new conversations, small gifts, and growing comfort between the young people. On the 7th evening, Amenhotep announced, Tomorrow begins the festival of Hathor, the temple processions, the music, the dancing. It's been 3 years since we've had such celebrations. The festival of Hathor was beloved throughout Egypt. The goddess of love, music, and fertility was patron to lovers, and during her festival, normal social restrictions relaxed. Young people could walk together through torchlit streets, listen to music, dance, and share food under the stars. "Would you permit me to escort Layet to the temple ceremonies?" Kemen asked formally. After a week of observation, Amenhotep had reached a favourable opinion. "You may escort her to the public ceremonies, but she must return home each night, and you will treat her with proper respect." The next evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in gold and crimson, the festival began. Torches were lit throughout the city, creating dancing shadows on mud brick walls. Music drifted from every quarter, drums, flutes, and the silvery rattle of sistrums. Kemen arrived dressed in his finest white linen, with his grandfather's collar of gold and lapis lazuli. When Layet emerged in her blue dress embroidered with silver threads, lotus flowers in her dark hair, Kemen felt his breath catch. "You're beautiful," he said softly. They walked through torch-lit streets toward the temple, following music and laughter. The courtyard was packed with celebrants, thick with incense and perfume. Musicians performed while dancers told stories of Hathor's myths. For the first time since their courtship began, they were truly alone, surrounded by hundreds, but free from family supervision. "The music is beautiful," Layet said, swaying to a haunting melody. "Not as beautiful as you," Kemen replied, then blushed at his boldness. Layet laughed like silver bells. "Is that the poetry they teach scribes at the temple?" "No, that's the poetry you inspire in scribes, who should probably stick to copying sacred texts." They shared date beer and honey cakes while watching dancers. As the evening progressed and music grew livelier, couples began dancing in the courtyard's open spaces. "Would you like to dance?" Kemen asked. Dancing together would be their most intimate act yet, a public declaration of growing attachment. "Yes," Layet said simply. The dance was ancient, a celebration of fertility and joy that honoured Hathor as protector of lovers. Kemen proved surprisingly graceful, while Layet moved like flowing water, her silver-embroidered dress catching torchlight with every turn. When the dance brought them close together, her lotus perfume filled his senses, and when their hands touched, he felt as if lightning had struck. As music reached its crescendo, Kemen found himself face to face with Layet, their hands clasped, eyes locked. For a moment that seemed eternal, the world faded away. There was only this woman, this perfect moment, this feeling of rightness. They walked to a quieter corner, where a small shrine had been set up for private offerings. Kemen placed the hymn he had written before the goddess's image, along with precious myrrh. "Great Hathor, look favourably on our courtship. Let our love grow strong and true, like the lotus that rises from mud to bloom in the sun." Layet added embroidered linen and precious perfume. "Beautiful goddess, if it is your will, let this man's heart be true to mine, and mine to his." As they stood together, a gentle breeze stirred the lotus flowers in Layet's hair, carrying their sweet scent toward the goddess's image. Both felt a sense of peace and rightness, as if Hathor herself had heard their prayers. At Layet's door they paused. Custom dictated Kemen should bid good night and leave, but both were reluctant to end this magical evening. "Thank you for a wonderful evening," Layet said softly. "There's something I want to say," Kemen began, "but I'm not sure I have the right words." "Then perhaps you should find them, skilled scribe that you are." Kemen took a deep breath. "I think I'm falling in love with you, not just with your beauty, though you're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen. with your kindness, your intelligence, your gentle spirit. And I think I'm falling in love with you too, Layet whispered, with your respect for learning, your devotion to the gods, your gentle strength. They stood in the torchlight, hands almost touching, hearts full of new love and ancient hope. Tomorrow would bring practical discussions, but tonight was theirs, blessed by Hathor and sanctified by honest feeling. In the days following the festival, Layet found herself thinking of Kemen constantly. His words of love echoed in her mind during long hours at the loom, and she caught herself weaving lotus flowers into patterns where they served no practical purpose. Her mother noticed the change, the humming while working, smiling at nothing, starting when spoken to as if her thoughts were far away. Love is beautiful, Nefertiti told her daughter one morning, but it can also make a person vulnerable. Are you certain of Kemen's feelings? Men sometimes speak sweetly during festivals when music and wine have affected their judgment. These words planted seeds of doubt. What if Kemen's declaration had been merely festival excitement? As days passed, Layet's anxiety grew. When he seemed distracted discussing temple work, she wondered if his thoughts were turning from love. When he failed to bring a small gift, as he had been doing, she worried his ardour was diminishing. Unable to bear the uncertainty, Layet decided to seek help. In her quarter lived an old woman named Taweret, known for love magic and protective spells. People came to her for charms for fertility, healing potions, or spells to ensure lovers' faithfulness. One afternoon, while her family was occupied, Layet slipped away to visit Taweret. The ancient woman lived near the river, surrounded by gardens of herbs and flowers used in magical practices. The air was heavy with incense and mysterious powders. Taweret was bent with age, but had sharp knowing eyes. She listened carefully as Layet explained her situation. Ah, child, the uncertainty of love, the oldest pain in the world. But Taweret knows how to bind a man's heart so it cannot wander. In her workroom, shelves held jars of mysterious substances, dried herbs, animal bones, and carved figurines. On a low table, she began assembling ingredients for a love spell. First, wax from sacred bees that pollinate lotus flowers, she explained, taking golden wax from a clay jar. This carries Hathor's essence. She moulded the wax into two small figures, male and female, chanting in words so old Layet could barely understand them. Then she bound them with red thread, spun from temple-blessed flax, joining them at heart, hands and forehead. Finally she drizzled honey blessed by 7 priestesses over the joined figures. Honey to make your love sweet, to draw his heart to yours, as bees are drawn to flowers. Taweret instructed Layet in the ritual. At sunrise tomorrow, take these to the river. Face east toward the rising sun and speak these words 3 times. As the sun rises each day without fail, so let Kemen's love for me never waver. As the Nile flows always toward the sea, so let his heart flow always toward mine. By Hathor's power and Isis's blessing, let it be so. Then bury the figures in soft mud where water will touch them. Layet paid with fine linen and frankincense, then hurried home with the wax figures hidden beneath her shawl. At dawn she crept to the river and performed the ritual exactly as instructed, then buried the joined figures in the mud. Walking home, Layet felt hope mixed with guilt. Love magic wasn't forbidden. Indeed, it was widely practiced, but she wondered if seeking magical intervention suggested lack of faith in naturally developing feelings. Whether through supernatural intervention or coincidence, the love spell seemed to work exactly as promised. Within days, Kemen's behaviour became even more attentive and devoted. He brought gifts more frequently, spent longer with her family, and spoke more openly of their future. On the 7th day after the spell, Cayman arrived with an announcement that sent the family into excited preparation. Honoured Amenhotep, I have received word from my father in Memphis. He and my mother wish to travel to Thebes to meet Liat and her family, if such a meeting would be welcome. They come prepared to discuss arrangements for our marriage. This was the formal proposal that would transform courtship into genuine betrothal. In Egyptian society, marriage was primarily a legal and social contract rather than religious ceremony. No priests were required. What mattered was mutual agreement of both families, establishment of a household, and public recognition. Your parents are most welcome, Amenhotep replied gravely. We will be honoured to receive them and discuss joining our families. When Kemen's parents arrived, they proved everything Liat had hoped. Sekhmet was a sturdy, practical man whose success was evident in well-made clothing and quality jewellery worn by his wife, Merit, whose musical background showed in graceful movements and melodious voice. Formal negotiations took place over several days. Kemen would remain in Thebes, where his temple position provided steady income. Layet would bring her loom and weaving supplies, along with household goods, furniture, pottery, oil lamps, cooking vessels, and food stores. Most importantly, they established legal framework protecting both parties. In Egyptian marriage law, women retained considerable rights. Layet would keep ownership of property she brought to marriage, and if the union ended, she would be entitled to 1/3 of wealth accumulated together. Finally came the actual marriage ceremony, or rather, the lack of one. Egyptian marriages were remarkably simple compared to elaborate weddings of many cultures. No priests officiated, no sacred vows were exchanged, no formal ceremony marked the transition. Instead, on a morning when the Nile ran particularly clear and air was sweet with blooming flowers, Cayman simply arrived with a cart to transport Layet's belongings. He had prepared a home, 3 rooms in a modest but well-built house near the temple, with a small garden. The entire neighbourhood gathered to witness the procession. Layet's loom, carefully wrapped, baskets of grain and oil, fine linens she had woven as trousseau, furniture her father had crafted, stools, storage chest, bed frame of polished sycamore. Layet wore her finest dress and jewellery, carrying special bread she had baked that morning, still warm from the oven. This bread would be the first food shared in their new home, symbolising commitment to sustain each other. As the procession wound through streets, neighbours called out blessings. Children ran alongside, laughing and singing marriage songs. Musicians appeared spontaneously, adding flutes and drums to the celebration. At their new home, Cayman lifted Layet over the threshold, formally acknowledging her as household mistress. Inside, families had prepared a simple feast: bread, beer, roasted duck, honey cakes, fresh fruit. The moment that truly sealed their marriage was beautifully simple. As the sun reached zenith, Cayman and Layet sat together on their sleeping mat and broke the bread she had carried from her father's house. Each fed the other a piece, sharing basic sustenance that symbolised their commitment. I take you as my husband, Layet said quietly, using traditional words spoken by Egyptian women for countless generations. I take you as my wife, Cayman replied, completing the formula that made them legally married. No elaborate ceremony, no lengthy rituals, no exchange of rings, simply 2 people choosing to share their lives, acknowledged by family and community, blessed by breaking bread together. Are you happy? Cayman asked softly, taking her hand. Completely, Layet replied, meaning it with all her heart. For the first months of marriage, their life unfolded like a beautiful dream. Their small home became a haven filled with the sound of Layet's loom, the scratch of Cayman's reed pen, and quiet evening conversations. But as seasons turned, their perfect happiness faced its first serious challenge. Among Kemen's fellow scribes was Seneb, whose father held important position in royal administration. Recently returned from Memphis, Seneb brought his sister, Anke-Senamun, a beautiful young woman whose name honoured the famous queen. Unlike Liat, who worked with her hands, Anke-Senamun was a lady of leisure, refined and well-educated, skilled in music and dance. When Seneb introduced his sister to temple colleagues, the effect was immediate. Even married men found excuses to linger in her presence, drawn by sophisticated beauty and worldly conversation. Kemen, initially secure in his marriage, gradually found himself drawn to Anke-Senamun's intellectual conversation. She visited frequently, bringing her brother meals and lingering to discuss philosophical texts he was copying. "Your work is so beautiful," she told Kemen one afternoon. "Your handwriting is like art itself, each character perfectly formed, flowing like music made visible." Such sophisticated praise differed greatly from Liat's simple appreciation. Anke-Senamun's comments came from someone who truly understood scribal subtleties. These innocent conversations began planting seeds of discontent. For the first time since marriage, Kemen imagined a different life, working on royal documents rather than routine records, associating with educated nobles rather than simple craftspeople, married to a refined lady who could discuss literature rather than a weaver who, however beloved, had limited education. The situation might have remained private temptation except for neighbourhood gossip. People noticed how often Anke-Senamun visited, how she timed arrivals to coincide with Kemen's presence, how she lingered talking with him while ignoring other scribes. Well-meaning friends told Liat her husband seemed quite taken with Seneb's beautiful sister, that the young woman appeared to be pursuing him openly, that perhaps Liat should be more careful about her marriage. At first Liat dismissed these warnings as idle gossip. Her marriage was strong, built on genuine love and mutual respect. But as reports continued and became more detailed, doubt crept in. When Kemen came home late claiming extra work, she wondered if he had been talking with Anke-Senamun. When he seemed distracted during conversations, she worried his thoughts were elsewhere. The crisis peaked during the festival of Thoth, god of wisdom and writing. As temple scribe's wife, Liat was invited to festivities. She spent days preparing, weaving a new dress and borrowing jewellery to ensure she looked her best. At the festival, she found herself near Anke-Senamun during ceremonies, and the comparison was devastating. Where Liat wore carefully crafted linen and borrowed jewellery, Anke-Senamun was draped in silk from distant lands, adorned with gold and precious stones that caught lamplight like captured stars. But it wasn't just clothing differences that made Liat feel inadequate. Anke-Senamun moved with natural confidence of someone born to privilege, speaking easily with officials and wives, displaying social grace from years of training. When ceremonies ended, Liat watched in dismay as Anke-Senamun approached Kemen with wine, engaging him in animated conversation about poetry recited during the ceremony. "The scribal arts are truly blessed by the gods," she was saying. "A man who captures thoughts in writing possesses immortality. His words will outlive his body, speaking to future generations." Kemen nodded enthusiastically, pleased by her understanding. "Exactly right. When I copy sacred texts, I feel I'm participating in something eternal." It was conversation Liat could never have had. Her appreciation was genuine but simple. She lacked education to engage with philosophical dimensions of his profession. Watching them talk, seeing how Kemen's face lit up with intellectual excitement, Liat felt something cold settle in her chest. Was this what her husband had been missing? Someone who could match his education, appreciate not just his skill, but the profound importance of his calling. That night, walking home through torchlit streets, Kemen sensed something was wrong. "You were very quiet tonight. Did you enjoy the festival?" Layat struggled for words that wouldn't sound like accusations. "It was educational. I learned how little I really know about your work, your world, the things important to you." "What are you talking about? You've always been interested in my work." "Interested? Yes, but not understanding. Not the way someone like Ankesenamun understands." Kemen felt guilt wash over him. Knowing his conversations with Seneb's sister hadn't been entirely innocent. "Layet, Ankesenamun is a friend, nothing more. You're my wife, the woman I chose to build my life with." "But she's the kind of woman you should have chosen, isn't she? Educated, refined, able to discuss literature and philosophy, able to help you advance, to move in circles where important decisions are made." The pain in her voice cut through Kemen's heart like a blade. "Number. She's not the woman I should have chosen because I already chose the right woman. I chose you, Layet. Not for your education or social connections, but for your kind heart, your gentle spirit, your beautiful soul. I chose you because you make me laugh, because you listen when I talk about dreams, because you create beauty and fill our home with love. But the way you talk with her," Kemen sighed, knowing he needed complete honesty. "Yes, I have enjoyed our conversations. She understands aspects of my work that you don't, and that was flattering. But understanding my work isn't the same as understanding me. She knows about literature and philosophy, but you know my heart." As they reached home, both knew their marriage had survived its first real crisis, but both understood that trust, once shaken, would take time and effort to fully restore. The conversation that night marked a turning point. In following days, both made conscious efforts to address issues that had nearly driven them apart. Kemen deliberately distanced himself from Ankesenamun, being polite but formal when she visited the scriptorium. He spoke proudly of his wife to colleagues and began sharing his professional world with Layet in ways that honoured both his education and her intelligence. In evenings, he told her about texts he was copying, explaining their significance in understandable terms. He began teaching her to read more complex scripts, building on basic literacy she had learned as a child. "This is a hymn to Isis," he explained one evening. "Listen, how the words flow like music. She who brings life from death, light from darkness, hope from despair." Layet listened carefully. "It's like weaving," she said thoughtfully. "Each word is like a thread, and together they create a pattern more beautiful than any single thread alone." Her insight delighted Kemen, and he began seeing his work through new eyes. Layet's artistic sensibility revealed aspects of texts his scholarly training had missed. For her part, Layet worked to overcome jealousy and insecurity. She realised her husband's intellectual interests were part of what made him the man she loved, and limiting them would ultimately damage their relationship. She threw herself into her own work with renewed energy, creating increasingly beautiful textiles that brought recognition beyond their community. When a wealthy merchant commissioned bed linens decorated with scenes from the Book of the Dead, Layet's reputation as an artist was established. The commission required extensive research into religious texts, and Kemen gladly helped her understand complex mythology she needed to portray. Working together brought them closer than they had been since their wedding, combining his knowledge with her artistry. Ankesenamun soon turned attention to other targets. Within a month, she was being courted by a treasury official, and before the next flood season, she was married and had moved to Memphis. As months passed, Kemen and Layet's marriage deepened. They had learned to weather crisis together, communicate honestly about fears and needs, and support each other's ambitions while maintaining primary loyalty to their partnership. The ultimate test came during Akhet season, when the Nile's annual flood brought both life and danger. This year's flood was particularly abundant, rising higher than anyone remembered and threatening to overwhelm dikes protecting the city. All residents were called to help strengthen flood defences. Kemen worked on dikes near the temple district, while Lyot joined women preparing food for workers and caring for children. For 3 days and nights, the battle continued. Just when waters seemed ready to overwhelm their defences, Layet discovered she was pregnant. The realisation came suddenly as she prepared evening meal for flood workers. The smell of cooking fish, which had never bothered her, suddenly made her violently nauseous. Her mother's voice echoed from years before. The first sign is often when familiar smells become unbearable. That night, when Kemen finally returned home, exhausted and mud-covered, Layet shared her suspicion. They sat together on their sleeping mat, bone-tired but filled with wonder at the possibility of new life beginning just as the flood brought renewal to the land. "Are you certain?" Kemen asked, voice filled with awe. "Not completely, but my body feels different, and the signs are there." As they held each other in darkness, listening to water flowing past their city, both felt the profound significance of this moment. Their love, tested by doubt and strengthened by honesty, was now bearing fruit in the most literal sense. The flood reached its peak the next day, then began gradual recession, leaving behind rich black soil that would make the coming harvest bountiful. As waters retreated, Lyot's pregnancy became certain, confirmed by experienced neighbourhood women. The news brought joy to both families. Amenhotep spoke proudly of his coming grandchild, while Nefertiti began collecting baby clothes and planning protective rituals. Kemen's parents, informed by letter, replied with gifts and blessings. As Layet's belly began to swell, the couple spent evenings making plans. They would need to expand their home, perhaps adding another room. Kemen spoke of working extra hours to save for additional expenses, while Layet planned to continue weaving as long as possible. Beyond practical concerns, they talked about what kind of parents they wanted to be, the values they hoped to instill, the world they wanted to create for the next generation. "I want our child to know both our worlds," Layet said one evening as they sat in their garden. "The world of words and learning that you love, and the world of creating beauty with hands that I love. And I want our child to understand that love isn't just a feeling," Kemen replied, his hand resting on her growing belly. "It's a choice you make every day, a commitment you renew through both easy times and difficult ones." As the baby grew within her, Layet often found herself standing by the Nile in early morning, watching the great river flow northward toward the sea. The water passing before her eyes would travel through the delta into the Mediterranean, touching distant lands she could barely imagine. Similarly, the child growing within her would carry their love into a future they could not foresee, becoming part of the eternal human story that flowed like the river itself through countless generations. The final scene came on a morning when the Nile ran particularly clear and bright, reflecting the sky like polished bronze. Layet stood at the river's edge, one hand resting on her prominent belly, feeling their child move restlessly within her. The baby would be born soon, perhaps with the next new moon. Behind her she could hear Thebes awakening, merchants setting up stalls, children laughing as they collected water, distant chanting of priests beginning morning rituals. Ahead the Nile flowed toward tomorrow, carrying the promise that life would continue, that love would endure, that their simple story would echo through time. like ripples spreading across still water. Kemen found her there, as he had taken to doing each morning before reporting to the temple. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, his hands joining hers on their unborn child. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. "About rivers," Layet replied, leaning back against his chest. "About how they start as tiny streams in distant mountains and grow into something mighty enough to sustain entire civilizations. About how our love started as a glance across a marketplace and grew into something strong enough to create new life. And about how rivers always flow toward the sea," Kemen added, understanding her thoughts, "just as our love flows toward the future, toward our child and their children, toward possibilities we can't even imagine." As they stood together watching the eternal river, both felt the profound truth that their story was both utterly unique and part of something much larger than themselves. 3,000 years in the future, other couples would stand by other rivers, holding each other and dreaming of children yet to be born, proving that some things, love, hope, the courage to build a life together, remain constant across all the centuries that divide past from present. The sun climbed higher, and reluctantly they turned away, to begin another day. There was work to be done, a living to be earned, a future to be built, one day at a time. But they carried with them the memory of this perfect moment, this quiet understanding that they had found something precious and enduring in a world where so little lasts forever. Behind them the Nile flowed on, as it always had and always would, carrying their hopes toward the sea and the tomorrow that waited for them all. Hello, dear readers of History Tales. Before we journey back to the mists of 13th century England, I hope your day has been filled with wonder and curiosity, whether it's morning, afternoon, or evening, where you're in this vast world of ours. Thank you for taking this moment to step into history with us. From the bustling cities of America to the ancient villages of Europe, from the vibrant landscapes of Asia to the diverse shores of Africa and beyond, our community spans the globe, united by our love of stories from the past. If you haven't already, please subscribe to History Tales to join our growing family of history enthusiasts. Now, let us venture into a time when love was a rebellion, when words were weapons against fate, and when two hearts dared to beat as one beneath the watchful eyes of Crown and Cross. The morning mist clung to the moors of Northumbria, like the breath of sleeping giants, and Elric of Thornley pulled his woolen cloak tighter against the October chill as he rode beside his father toward Varnum Castle. The year was 1284, and the leaves had turned the colour of dried blood and burnished copper, carpeting the ancient Roman road with nature's own tapestry. At 22, Elric was already taller than most men in their village of Thornley, with dark hair that refused to stay properly groomed and eyes the colour of storm clouds over the Scottish borderlands. His father, Godwin the Reeve, sat straight in his saddle despite his 50-odd years, his weathered hands steady on the reins of their pack-horse laden with ledgers and tax rolls. As the king's representative in their small corner of England, Godwin commanded respect throughout the region, but today his usual confidence seemed strained. The harvest had been poor, and the villagers' faces had grown gaunt with the approach of winter. Yet King Edward's demands for silver remained unchanged, as constant as the northern winds. "Remember, son," Godwin said, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom, "Lord Aldrich de Varnham is not a man to suffer delays or excuses. He serves the crown faithfully, and he expects the same from those beneath him. Speak only when spoken to, and keep your thoughts about the king's taxes to yourself." Elric nodded, though his jaw tightened. He had learned to read and write Latin from the village priest, Father Benedict, and had studied enough to understand that the common folk bore burdens that would crush the very horses their betters rode. But he also understood that such thoughts were dangerous in a world where a peasant's opinion mattered less than the mud on a lord's boots. The castle appeared through the morning haze like something from the illuminated manuscripts Elric had seen in the monastery at Hexham. Built of dark stone quarried from the nearby hills, Varnham Castle rose from its rocky prominence with the grim authority of Norman architecture. Its walls had witnessed nearly 2 centuries of border conflicts, first with the Scots, then with Welsh rebels, and now with anyone who dared question King Edward's expanding appetite for conquest and coin. As they approached the gatehouse, Elric caught sight of movement in one of the upper windows of the keep. A figure stood silhouetted against the narrow opening, too distant to make out clearly, but something about the stillness of the form suggested a watcher rather than someone merely passing by. The figure remained there as they passed beneath the portcullis, and Elric found himself wondering who might stand so still, so long, gazing out at the endless moors. The bailey bustled with the controlled chaos of a great household, preparing for winter. Servants hurried between the storehouses and kitchens, their arms laden with sacks of grain and barrels of ale. Grooms tended to the horses of various visitors, and men-at-arms practised their sword work in the morning light, their blades ringing against wooden pels with rhythmic precision. Lord Aldrich de Varnham received them in his solar, a chamber warmed by a great fireplace and made bright by precious glass windows. He was a man in his middle years, his beard shot through with silver, and his eyes sharp with the calculation that came from managing vast estates and navigating the treacherous currents of royal favour. Behind him stood his steward, a thin man named Master Geoffrey, who scratched notes on parchment with a quill that seemed perpetually in motion. "Godwin of Thornley," Lord Aldrich said, gesturing for them to approach. "Your timing is fortuitous. I have need of accurate records before I travel to York next month. The king summons his northern lords, and I must account for every acre and every soul under my protection." As his father began the familiar ritual of presenting tax rolls and discussing the yields from various holdings, Elric let his gaze wander around the solar. The walls were adorned with tapestries depicting hunting scenes and heraldic beasts, while a carved crucifix dominated the space above the hearth. Books bound in leather and brass occupied a chest near the window, their very presence speaking of wealth and education that few could afford. It was then that she entered. Lady Isolde de Varnham moved with the measured grace that noble daughters learned from their earliest years, her steps silent on the rushes that covered the stone floor. She wore a gown of deep blue wool, simply cut but richly woven, with sleeves that reached to her knuckles and a white linen veil that framed her face without completely concealing her auburn hair. Her eyes were the colour of winter lakes, and they held a depth that seemed at odds with her perhaps 18 years. "Father," she said, her voice soft but clear, "Master Geoffrey requested these household accounts." She extended a roll of parchment toward the steward, but her gaze briefly met Elric's across the chamber. In that moment, something passed between them that neither could have named. It was not the sudden passion of troubadour songs, nor the courtly love celebrated in the romances that travelled from France. Instead, it was a recognition, as if two solitary souls had glimpsed their own loneliness reflected in another's eyes. "Ah, my daughter," Lord Aldrich said with obvious pride. "Isolde has been managing the household accounts since her mother's death 3 years past. She has a fine hand with figures and letters, unusual in a woman but useful in these times." His tone carried the subtle boast of a father whose daughter could bring a higher bride price because of her accomplishments. Lady Isolde curtsied properly and turned to leave, but not before Elric noticed the way her gaze lingered on the books in their chest, and how her fingers seemed to trace invisible words against the fabric of her gown. When she glanced back once more before disappearing through the doorway, he saw something that made his heart contract. With unexpected sympathy, she looked like a bird that had forgotten how to sing. The business of tax collection proceeded with its usual mixture of negotiation and barely veiled threat. Lord Aldrich was not cruel, but he was thorough, and every silver penny owed to the crown would be collected regardless of individual hardship. Elric found his attention drifting, however, drawn repeatedly to the window where he had seen the watching figure that morning. Was it she who stood there, looking out at the moors with such patient longing? "Your son shows promise, Godwin," Lord Aldrich observed as they concluded their business. "Can he read, as well as cipher?" "Aye, my lord. Father Benedict taught him Latin and something of Greek. He's helped me with correspondence since he was 16. "Good. I may have need of a clerk who can travel between my holdings. Master Geoffrey grows too old for winter journeys, and I require someone who can be trusted with delicate matters." The Lord's eyes fixed on Elric with calculating interest. "Would you be willing to serve in such capacity, young Thornley?" Elric felt his father's sharp glance and knew that refusal was not truly an option. To serve a lord directly was an honour that could elevate their family's standing, perhaps even lead to a grant of land in reward for faithful service. Yet something in Lord Aldrich's tone suggested that such service might come with complications he did not yet understand. "I would be honoured to serve your lordship, in whatever capacity you deem fit," Elric replied carefully. "Excellent. You shall begin after Martinmas. Master Geoffrey will instruct you in the peculiarities of managing estates that stretch from here to the border with Scotland. There will be much travel involved, and much correspondence with other lords, the church, and occasionally the royal chancery itself." As they prepared to depart, Elric found himself scanning the windows of the keep once more. This time he was rewarded with another glimpse of the solitary figure, though distance still made identification impossible. Something about that stillness spoke to him of resignation rather than patience, of watching for something that would never come, rather than waiting for something that might. The ride home passed in contemplative silence. Godwin seemed pleased with the prospect of his son's advancement, but Elric found his thoughts returning again, and again, to Lady Isolde's winter-lake eyes, and the way she had looked at those precious books as if they contained secrets she longed to unlock. In a world where most women were forbidden to read beyond the prayers necessary for salvation, her obvious literacy marked her as unusual, but it was more than that. There had been something in her bearing that suggested intelligence constrained, spirit held in check by the iron requirements of birth and gender. That evening, As Elric helped his father record the day's transactions by candlelight, he found himself composing words he would never speak aloud. In his mind, he crafted sentences in Latin, the language of learning and the church, imagining how one might describe the way morning mist transformed familiar landscapes into something magical, or how a single glance could carry the weight of unspoken understanding. He did not yet know that Lady Isolde spent her evenings in much the same way, standing at her window and watching the moors darken under the stars, while in her mind she composed replies to conversations that had never taken place with a young man whose eyes held the same mixture of intelligence and constraint that she recognised in her own. Neither knew that within a fortnight, circumstances would force them into a correspondence that would challenge everything they had been taught about duty, faith, and the proper order of the world. The willow tree that grew beside the ruins of an old Roman watchtower, halfway between Varnham Castle and the village of Thornley, waited in the autumn twilight like a secret keeper, its branches already bare but its roots deep enough to survive whatever storms might come. For now they were simply two souls who had glimpsed something in each other across the gulf that separated their stations in life. But in an age when love was luxury and marriage was commerce, even that brief recognition carried the seeds of both transcendence and tragedy. The dance of their careful destruction had begun, though neither yet knew the steps. Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it the kind of bitter cold that made even the stones of Varnham Castle weep with frost. By the feast of St Andrew, Elric had settled into his new role as Lord Aldrich's travelling clerk, a position that required him to journey between the scattered holdings of the Dalvarnham estates, carrying messages, updating records, and serving as his lordship's eyes and ears in matters both mundane and sensitive. It was during one of these journeys that opportunity first presented itself in the guise of routine duty. Master Geoffrey had taken ill with a fever that left him bedridden for weeks, and the castle's correspondence had begun to accumulate, like snow in a sheltered corner. Among the waiting letters were several from monasteries and cathedral schools, scholarly exchanges that required responses in proper Latin, and an understanding of theological nuance that was beyond most clerks. Lord Aldrich, growing impatient with the delays, had commanded Elric to handle all such correspondence. "The girl can help you," he said dismissively, gesturing toward his daughter. "Isolde reads Latin better than most priests, though God knows why her mother insisted on such education. Still, it may prove useful in finding her a husband among the learned lords." And so it was that Elric found himself working alongside Lady Isolde in the scriptorium, a small chamber adjacent to the solar that housed the castle's modest collection of books and writing materials. The room was barely large enough for two people, lit by narrow windows during the day and oil lamps in the evening, filled with the scents of parchment, ink, and the beeswax used to seal important documents. Their first collaboration was innocent enough, a response to the Abbot of Rievaulx regarding the boundaries of certain lands that had been granted to the monastery by Lord Aldrich's grandfather. Isolde sat across from Elric at the oak table, her own copy of the original charter spread before her, while he composed the reply in his careful Latin script. The phrase should be "in perpetuum," not "in perpetuitate," she said quietly, leaning forward to point at a line in his draft. "The abbot is learned in classical usage, and the correct form will show proper respect." Elric looked up from his parchment, meeting her eyes for the first time since that day in the solar. Up close he could see golden flecks in the winter blue depths, and notice how her brow furrowed slightly when she concentrated on a difficult passage. "You're quite right, my lady. I was thinking in the ecclesiastical style rather than the classical." A small smile touched the corners of her mouth, the first genuine expression he had seen from her. "Father Benedict taught you Latin, didn't he? I can tell from your hand." He has a particular way of forming his letters that he passes to all his students. You know Father Benedict? He was my mother's confessor, and he continued instructing me after her death. Father says learning is wasted on women, but... She paused, glancing toward the doorway as if checking for listeners. But I think God would not have given us minds if he intended them to remain empty. It was a dangerous sentiment, one that bordered on the heretical in the opinion of many churchmen, but Elric found himself nodding in agreement. The Blessed Virgin herself was learned, according to the Gospel of Luke. She knew the scriptures well enough to compose the Magnificat. Something shifted in the air between them at that moment, a recognition that they were both souls who hungered for knowledge in a world that offered it sparingly to those of their stations. They worked in comfortable silence for the remainder of the afternoon, occasionally consulting each other on matters of translation or diplomatic phrasing, their conversations conducted in the careful, formal language appropriate to their different ranks. But when they began to correspond with the school at Chartres regarding a request for manuscripts to copy, their exchanges took on a different quality. The letters were addressed to learned men who thought in abstract terms about philosophy, theology, and the nature of truth itself. In crafting responses worthy of such correspondence, Elric and Isolde found themselves discussing ideas that went far beyond the practical matters of estate management. What do you think Master Aquinas means when he writes of love as the form of all virtues? Isolde asked one December afternoon, looking up from a letter they had received from a scholar at the University of Paris. Elric set down his quill, considering. They had grown comfortable enough in each other's presence that such philosophical questions seemed natural, though he was always careful to maintain the proper forms of address. Perhaps he means that virtue without love is merely obedience, my lady. That true goodness must flow from affection for the good itself, rather than fear of punishment. But then, what of marriages arranged for duty rather than affection? Are they virtuous or merely expedient? The question seemed to carry more weight than its theoretical nature suggested, and Elric felt the dangerous ground opening beneath their feet. He chose his words carefully. I think that perhaps virtue can grow where it did not originally flourish if tended with patience and genuine care, though it must be harder to nurture something that was never planted by choice. Their eyes met across the narrow table, and in that look passed an understanding that neither could have voiced aloud. Isolde was betrothed, though the formal arrangements were still being negotiated. The groom was Baron Willoughby of Westmoreland, a man of 40-odd years, whose first wife had died in childbirth, leaving him without male heirs. He was wealthy, connected to important families, and known for his skill in the king's service during the Welsh campaigns. He was also known for his harsh treatment of tenants and his tendency to solve disputes with his sword, rather than his wit. The Baron sent a gift, Isolde said quietly, nodding toward a corner of the scriptorium where a small casket sat unopened. A necklace of garnets and gold. Father was quite pleased with the generosity. Elric looked at the casket, as if it were a serpent coiled to strike. It is very fine, I'm sure. I have not opened it. The simple statement carried layers of meaning. To refuse to examine a betrothal gift was a small act of rebellion, but rebellion nonetheless. I find myself more interested in gifts that feed the mind rather than adorn the body. It was then that Elric made the decision that would alter the course of both their lives. Reaching into the leather satchel that contained his writing materials, he withdrew a small book bound in soft brown leather. It was his own copy of Ovid's Metamorphoses, the one he had copied by hand during long winter evenings, decorating the margins with small illuminations of his own design. "This is not a gift, my lady," he said carefully, "but merely a loan. I thought you might find the stories instructive. Ovid writes of transformation, of the ways that love can change the very nature of those it touches. Isolde's fingers trembled slightly as she accepted the book, and Elric noticed how she held it, as if it were made of something infinitely precious. "I shall read it with great attention," she said, "and perhaps I might offer observations on the text, in the margins, where such thoughts would not interfere with the original. I would be honoured by your observations, my lady." And so began their true correspondence, conducted not through direct letters, but through marginalia in the books they shared. Elric would leave a volume in the scriptorium with his own thoughts pencilled lightly beside certain passages, and Isolde would respond with her own commentary in a different ink. They discussed Ovid's tales of forbidden love and divine punishment, debated the philosophical implications of transformation and desire, and gradually began to include more personal reflections alongside their scholarly observations. In the margins of the story of Pyramus and Thisbe, the lovers separated by a wall, Isolde wrote in her precise Latin script, "How strange that stone should be stronger than the human heart, yet more easily broken by time." Beside the tale of Apollo and Daphne, Elric penned, "Perhaps the gods envy mortals our ability to choose love over safety. Divine power seems a poor exchange for the freedom to surrender one's heart willingly." Their communication expanded to include other texts as well. When a manuscript of selected psalms arrived from the monastery at Durham, they found themselves conducting theological discussions in the spaces between verses. Augustine's Confessions became a forum for exploring the relationship between earthly and divine love, while a collection of letters by Heloise and Abelard sparked conversations about the proper relationship between reason and passion. By Candlemas, their exchanges had grown bold enough that they began to include references that only the other would understand. A casual mention of a particular psalm during dinner conversation would tell Isolde that a new book awaited her attention in the scriptorium. A comment about the weather or the condition of the roads would inform Elric that she had completed her reading and left her own thoughts for his consideration. It was around this time that they began to venture beyond the scriptorium walls, though always under the pretense of legitimate business. When Elric needed to survey damage to a tenant farm near the old Roman ruins, Isolde expressed interest in seeing the ancient stones herself, claiming scholarly curiosity about the builders who had ruled Britain before the Saxon kings. Lord Aldrich, pleased by his daughter's intellectual pursuits and confident in her virtue, allowed her to ride out with a suitable escort of servants. The ruined watchtower stood on a low hill, perhaps 2 miles from the castle, its broken walls now home to ravens and wild roses. Beside it grew an ancient willow, its trunk thick enough that 3 men could not have encircled it with their arms, its drooping branches creating a natural pavilion that provided shelter from both sun and rain. Local legend claimed the tree had been planted by Roman soldiers, homesick for the Mediterranean, though Elric suspected it was simply old enough to have witnessed the rise and fall of empires. They dismounted near the ruins and walked among the tumbled stones, while their escorts tended the horses. Isolde traced Latin inscriptions carved into fallen blocks, translating the words of long-dead soldiers who had served along Hadrian's Wall, but it was beneath the willow that they found themselves alone for the first time, screened by the curtain of trailing branches from the view of servants and retainers. "I have been thinking about transformation," Isolde said, settling gracefully on a flat stone that had once formed part of a wall. Ovid writes of change as if it were always imposed from without, gods punishing mortals, or rewarding them, or simply amusing themselves with our fates. But what of the transformations we choose for ourselves? Elric remained standing, though every instinct urged him to sit beside her. Even here, propriety demanded careful attention to the forms that separated their stations. "What sort of transformation do you mean, my lady?" "The kind that comes from discovering that one's heart is not what one thought it was." She looked up at him through the dappled light that filtered through the willow's branches. "From learning that duty and desire need not always walk the same path." The words hung in the air between them, like a challenge and a confession combined. Elric felt the foundations of his carefully ordered world shifting beneath him, but found he could not regret the tremor. Such transformations can be dangerous, especially for those who are not born to choose their own paths freely. "All the most worthwhile transformations are dangerous," Isolde replied. "That is what makes them genuine, rather than merely cosmetic." They stood looking at each other in the green twilight beneath the willow, both aware that they had reached a precipice beyond which lay territory that could not be safely explored. The sound of servants calling to each other about the failing light broke the spell, and they emerged from the tree's shelter as carefully as they had entered it, speaking now of Roman engineering and the defensive advantages of the ruined site. But something had changed between them during those few moments of perfect privacy. They had acknowledged, without quite saying so, that their careful correspondence and scholarly discussions had grown into something that transcended the bounds of appropriate interaction between a lord's daughter and a reeve's son. They were still cautious, still circumspect, but no longer able to pretend that their connection was purely intellectual. Their visits to the willow became a regular part of Elric's duties, always justified by some estate business that required attention in that area. Isolde accompanied him when weather and circumstance permitted, and their conversations beneath the ancient tree grew more personal with each meeting. They spoke of their childhoods, their fears, their dreams of a world where learning was valued above lineage, and where hearts might choose their own destinations. They also began to speak more directly of the approaching crisis that Baron Willoughby's suit represented. The negotiations were proceeding smoothly, with both fathers eager to conclude an arrangement that would benefit their respective positions. A wedding date had been tentatively set for late spring, after Easter, but before the campaigning season that would call the Baron to serve his king in whatever war Edward might devise. "Sometimes I dream that I am a bird caught in a net," Isolde confessed, one March afternoon, as they sat beneath the willow, watching storm clouds gather over the moors. "The more I struggle, the more tightly the cords bind me, but in the dream there is always someone standing just beyond the net's edge, someone who might cut the cords if they were not afraid of the hunter's anger." Elric's hands clenched involuntarily at the image. And what if the one standing beyond the net were merely another kind of cage, my lady? What if freedom won in such a manner proved to be only a different sort of captivity? At least it would be a cage one entered by choice, rather than inheritance. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a messenger from the castle, bearing word that Baron Willoughby himself was approaching with a small retinue, intent on finalising the marriage contracts and meeting his bride-to-be. The courtship in shadows was about to face the harsh light of political reality, and both Elric and Isolde knew that their careful dance of words and glances would soon be forced to end. As they rode back toward Varnham Castle, the willow tree stood behind them like a faithful sentinel, its branches already beginning to show the pale green promise of spring. Neither knew that it would be many months before they stood beneath its shelter together again, or that when they did, the world they had known would have altered beyond recognition. Baron Willoughby arrived at Varnham Castle on a morning when March winds had stripped the sky bare and set the banners snapping like battle standards above the gatehouse. He came with a retinue of 20 men-at-arms and servants, their horses mud-splattered from the journey north. their gear marking them as veterans of King Edward's campaigns. The Baron himself rode a destrier black as midnight, its hooves striking sparks from the cobblestones of the bailey as he dismounted with the fluid grace of a man born to warfare. Elric watched from the scriptorium window as the arrival unfolded below, his hands motionless on the parchment where he had been copying inventory lists. Baron Willoughby was not what he had expected. Rather than the ageing warrior he had imagined, the Baron appeared to be a man in his early 40s, tall and powerful in build, with the kind of commanding presence that drew attention even in a crowded hall. His hair was dark brown, shot through with premature silver, and his face bore the kind of weathered handsomeness that spoke of years spent under campaign skies. "He is not unpleasing to look upon," said a quiet voice behind him, and Elric turned to find Lady Isolde standing in the doorway of the scriptorium. She wore her finest gown, deep green wool with golden thread at the sleeves and neckline, and her hair was arranged in the elaborate braids that marked her as an unmarried woman of noble birth. Yet for all her finery, her face was pale as winter moonlight. "My lady," Elric began, but she raised a hand to forestall whatever comfort he might have offered. "I have come to return this," she said, extending the leather-bound copy of Ovid's Metamorphoses that had served as the silent messenger of their correspondence for months. "It would not be proper for me to keep books that belong to another, now that my circumstances are about to change." Elric accepted the volume with hands that trembled slightly, though whether from sorrow or relief, he could not say. The book felt heavier than it should have, weighted with all the thoughts and feelings they had shared in its margins. "Of course, my lady, I understand. Do you?" Her winter blue eyes searched his face with an intensity that made him step back. "Do you truly understand what's happening here, Elric of Thornley?" The use of his full name, rather than the formal titles she usually employed, struck him like a physical blow. It was the first time she had spoken his name aloud in all their months of careful conversation, and it carried the weight of everything they had never been able to say directly. "I understand that duty calls, and that we must both answer," he replied, though the words tasted like ashes in his mouth. "I understand that some transformations are chosen for us whether we will them or not." "Yes," she said softly, "some transformations are indeed chosen for us, but that does not mean we must surrender all choice in how we meet them." Before he could ask what she meant by that cryptic statement, footsteps echoed in the corridor outside, and Master Geoffrey appeared in the doorway. The old steward had recovered from his winter illness, but remained frail, his face bearing the grey pallor of someone who had looked too closely at his own mortality. "Lady Isolde," he wheezed, "your father requires your presence in the great hall." "The Baron wishes to meet his bride." She inclined her head gracefully, every inch the dutiful daughter, but her eyes remained fixed on Elric for a moment longer. "Remember," she said, and though she spoke to Master Geoffrey, her words were clearly meant for him, that the willow tree sheds its leaves each autumn, yet remains alive through the darkest winter. Some things endure even when they appear to have died. Then she was gone, leaving Elric alone with the returned book, and the bitter knowledge that their season of secret correspondence had come to its inevitable end. The betrothal ceremony took place 3 days later in the castle's chapel, a small stone building that had been decorated with spring flowers and the best tapestries from Lord Aldrich's collection. Baron Willoughby knelt beside Lady Isolde before the altar, while Father Marcus, the castle's chaplain, spoke the Latin words that would bind them in the eyes of God and man. Elric, standing with the other household members at the back of the chapel, watched as rings were exchanged and vows spoken in voices that carried to every corner of the sacred space. The Baron's voice was strong and confident as he promised to honour and protect his bride. Lady Isolde's responses were quiet but clear, each word precisely articulated as if she were reading from a script rather than speaking from her heart. When Father Marcus pronounced them betrothed in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, Baron Willoughby lifted his bride's hand to his lips and kissed it with what appeared to be genuine tenderness. The feast that followed was a magnificent affair, with tables groaning under the weight of roasted meats, fresh bread, and wine imported from Gascony. Musicians played lively tunes that encouraged dancing, and the Baron proved himself an accomplished partner, leading Lady Isolde through the complex steps of courtly dances with skill and obvious pleasure. To any observer they appeared to be a well-matched couple, he with his warrior's confidence and she with her quiet grace. But Elric, watching from his place at the lower tables, could see the careful distance she maintained, even while following her betrothed's lead. Her smiles were perfectly polite, but never reached her eyes, and her conversations with the Baron carried the formal courtesy of diplomatic negotiations rather than the warmth of personal affection. She was playing her role flawlessly, but it was unmistakably a role rather than genuine emotion. The Baron, for his part, seemed pleased with his prize. He spoke of Lady Isolde's beauty and accomplishments to anyone who would listen, praised Lord Aldrich's wisdom in raising such a daughter, and made clear his eagerness to complete the marriage as soon as arrangements could be finalised. The wedding was set for the week after Easter, barely a month away, to be followed by the couple's departure for the Baron's holdings in Westmoreland. She will be mistress of 3 castles and lands that stretch from the Eden Valley to the Irish Sea, Baron Willoughby declared during the evening's entertainment. And I'll wager that within a year she'll have given me the son my first wife could never provide. The casual cruelty of the comment, spoken within Lady Isolde's hearing, made Elric's hands clench beneath the table. He saw her flinch slightly at the words, though she covered the reaction so quickly that he doubted anyone else noticed. The Baron was not intentionally cruel, Elric realised, but rather thoughtlessly confident in his right to speak of his betrothed as property to be evaluated and utilised. After the official celebrations concluded, Elric found himself working late in the scriptorium, ostensibly organising documents, but in truth seeking solitude to process the day's events. The castle had grown quiet around him, the sounds of revelry fading as guests retired to their chambers and servants finished their cleaning. He was so absorbed in his melancholy thoughts that he did not hear the soft footsteps in the corridor until a familiar voice spoke from the doorway. "I thought I might find you here," Lady Isolde said, stepping into the chamber and closing the door behind her. She had changed from her formal gown into a simpler dress of dark blue wool, and her hair hung loose around her shoulders in a way that made her look younger and more vulnerable than he had ever seen her. "My lady!" Elric rose quickly from his seat, acutely aware that they were alone together in a way that propriety absolutely forbade. "You should not be here. If someone were to discover us—" "Let them," she said, with a flash of defiance that transformed her entire bearing. "I am betrothed now, not yet married. I am still free to speak with whom I choose, at least for a few more weeks. But your reputation—" "My reputation is no longer my own to guard," she interrupted. "It belongs to Baron Willoughby now, along with everything else. But my thoughts, my words, my memories, those remain mine for a little while longer." She moved closer to the table where he had been working, her fingers trailing across the scattered documents, as if she were memorising their texture. "I wanted to give you something," she said quietly, "a token of friendship, of gratitude for the months of conversation and learning we have shared." From the folds of her gown, she withdrew a small object wrapped in silk. When she unfolded the fabric, Elric saw that it contained a wooden token carved in the shape of a book, no larger than his thumb, The craftsmanship was extraordinary, with tiny letters etched into the wooden pages that spelled out a single Latin phrase, Amor vincit omnia. Love conquers all, Elric translated softly, accepting the token with hands that shook. My lady, I cannot. You can, and you will, she said firmly. It is a gift, freely given, with no expectation of anything in return, save that you remember our conversations with kindness. He closed his fingers around the small carving, feeling its warmth and the careful attention that had gone into its creation. Did you make this yourself? During the long evenings when sleep would not come, I told my maids I was working on embroidery. A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. I think God will forgive the deception, considering the purpose. They stood looking at each other in the flickering lamplight, both aware that this might be their last opportunity for private conversation. The weight of all the things they had never been able to say openly pressed down upon them like stones. I will treasure this always, Elric said finally, and I will remember not just our words, but the courage it took to speak them. As will I, she whispered, and for a moment it seemed she might reach out to touch his hand. Instead, she stepped back toward the door. Farewell, Elric of Thornley. May God grant you the happiness that circumstances have denied us both. The wedding took place as planned, a grand affair that drew nobles from across the northern counties. Lady Isolde became Lady Willoughby in a ceremony of magnificent splendour, her face serene as marble as she spoke the vows that bound her forever to a man she respected but could never love. Baron Willoughby was generous in victory, gifting Lord Aldrich with fine horses and promising Elric continued employment managing correspondence between their estates. But fate, as Ovid knew well, delights in unexpected transformations. 3 weeks after the wedding, King Edward's summons arrived. All able-bodied men between 16 and 40 were to join the royal levy for a new campaign in Wales. The king's patience with Welsh resistance had finally expired, and he intended to crush it with overwhelming force. Baron Willoughby would lead his own men south, but the levy required bodies, and Elric's name appeared on the muster rolls. It's only temporary, Lord Aldrich assured him, as they prepared his equipment. A summer's campaign, perhaps less. The Welsh have no stomach for real warfare. The Welsh campaigns stretched into 2 bitter years of mountain warfare, siege and disease. Elric served in the baggage train, and later as a clerk for the army's quartermaster, his literacy making him valuable for recording supplies and casualties. He survived the bloody assault on Caernarfon, witnessed the construction of Edward's great castles, and saw too many good men die far from home. News from England came sporadically. Baron Willoughby had returned to his estates after the first year, having been wounded in a skirmish near Snowdon. Lady Isolde had nursed him back to health, but remained childless, a situation that caused increasing tension in their marriage. Lord Aldrich's letters grew shorter and more infrequent as his own health began to fail. When Elric finally returned to Northumbria in the autumn of 1287, he found a world transformed by loss. Lord Aldrich had died the previous winter, and his estates had passed to a distant cousin. Lady Isolde had become a widow when Baron Willoughby succumbed to infection from his Welsh wounds, leaving her with a modest dower but no children to secure her position. She had retired to a small manor that had been part of her mother's dowry, living quietly with a handful of servants and devoting herself to works of charity. When Elric first saw her again, standing in the garden of her modest home, she seemed smaller somehow, worn thin by years of duty and loss. But her eyes still held their winter blue depth, and when she smiled at his approach, he saw the ghost of the girl who had once debated philosophy in the margins of borrowed books. "You kept it," she said, noticing the wooden token he wore on a cord around his neck, visible now that his travel-stained tunic had pulled loose. "Always," he replied. "It was my talisman through 2 years of war." They walked together through her small garden, speaking carefully of neutral things, the harvest, the new lord's policies, the state of the roads. But gradually, as the afternoon wore on, their conversation began to encompass more personal matters. She told him of her marriage, describing Baron Willoughby as a man who had been neither cruel nor kind, simply indifferent to anything beyond his own desires and ambitions. He wanted sons, she said simply. When none came, he blamed me, as men do. But perhaps it was God's mercy that I never bore children to a man I could not love. Elric had his own stories of loss and survival, of friends who had died in foreign mountains, and the strange brotherhood that forms among men who have faced death together. But as they talked, he found himself watching the way evening light caught in her hair, now touched with silver at the temples, and marvelling at how the years had refined rather than diminished her beauty. "There is something I must show you," she said, as the sun began to set. "Something I have maintained in hope of this day." She led him through the dusk to a familiar place, the old Roman ruins where the ancient willow still stood sentinel over the moors. But now the tree was no longer alone. Around its base someone had planted a garden of herbs and flowers, creating a circle of cultivated beauty within the wild landscape. At the base of the willow's massive trunk, a small shrine had been built from carefully fitted stones, containing a simple wooden cross and a place where candles could be lit in prayer. "I come here every week," Isolde explained, kneeling to light a candle from the flint she carried, to tend the garden, to pray for the dead, and to remember a time when love seemed possible, rather than merely theoretical. Elric knelt beside her, adding his own prayer to whatever communion she maintained with the divine. In the flickering candlelight, surrounded by the scent of late roses and the whisper of wind through willow branches, he felt something shift in his understanding of what love might mean in a world governed by duty and loss. "I never married," he said quietly. "After I returned from Wales, I told myself it was because I had seen too much death to risk creating new life. But the truth is simpler. I never found anyone who made me want to forget you." She turned to look at him, her face luminous in the candlelight. "Nor I you. Even when duty required me to share another's bed, my heart remained here, under this tree, in the place where we first spoke truly to each other." They were no longer young lovers stealing moments from duty. They were mature adults who had learned the weight of vows and the cost of honour. What passed between them now was deeper than the passion of youth. It was the recognition of souls that had found their proper match despite every obstacle the world could devise. They never lived together as man and wife, for propriety and law still bound them even in their freedom. Isolde remained the widow of Baron Willoughby, entitled to her dower lands and the respect due her station. Elric became a scribe and teacher in the nearby monastery, his learning and experience making him valuable to the monks who maintained the region's records and correspondence. But every St. Valentine's Eve, two figures could be seen walking together toward the old Roman ruins, carrying flowers and candles to the shrine beneath the willow tree. They spoke of many things during these annual pilgrimages: philosophy and theology, the changing world around them, the small victories and defeats of ordinary life. They shared their thoughts on the books they read, the letters they wrote, the people they served. Most of all, they shared the deep contentment of two people who had found in each other not just love, but understanding. Their relationship transcended the physical limitations that society had imposed upon them, becoming something more enduring than passion and more profound than mere companionship. As the years passed, their annual meetings became a local legend. Villagers spoke of the lady and the scholar who met beneath the willow tree, leaving flowers and maintaining the shrine with faithful regularity. Some claimed they were lovers, others insisted they were merely old friends, honouring shared memories. The truth was both simpler and more complex than either explanation could encompass. When Isolde died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 57, Elric was the one who found her, having come as usual for their Valentine's Eve meeting. She lay in her bed as if merely sleeping, a small smile on her lips and a letter addressed to him in Latin on the table beside her. The letter contained instructions for her burial and a final gift, the deed to her small manor, left to him with the provision that he maintain the shrine beneath the willow and continue their tradition of annual remembrance. Elric lived another 15 years, teaching generations of young monks to read and write, copying manuscripts, and corresponding with scholars across Europe. But every St. Valentine's Eve found him at the willow tree, now old and bent but still faithful to their covenant. He would light 2 candles instead of 1, lay flowers for both of them, and spend the evening reading aloud from the books they had once shared, as if she was still there to offer her thoughtful commentary. When death finally claimed him on a winter morning in 1321, the monks found him at his writing desk, having just completed a letter to a scholar in Paris about the proper translation of Augustine's Confessions. Beside his right hand lay a small wooden token carved in the shape of a book, worn smooth by decades of handling, inscribed with the words Amor vincit omnia. For years after both were gone, villagers continued to find fresh flowers beneath the willow tree on St. Valentine's Eve, though no one ever saw who placed them there. Some said it was angels, honouring the memory of love that had transcended earthly limitations. Others claimed it was the work of romantic young people who had heard the story and wanted to honour its legacy. A century later, when a young monk named Brother Francis was cataloguing the monastery's collection of books and documents, he discovered a cache of manuscripts hidden behind a loose stone in the scriptorium wall. Among them were letters, poems, and philosophical treatises written in 2 different hands, engaged in a decades-long conversation about love, faith, and the nature of human connection. Brother Francis read through the entire collection, marvelling at the depth of learning and the evident affection that had sustained such a lengthy correspondence. At the bottom of the cache, wrapped in silk that had faded to the colour of old parchment, he found the wooden token and a final note written in Elric's familiar hand. Here lies the record of a love that conquered not through possession, but through patience, not through defiance of God's law, but through submission to love's higher law. May all who read these words remember that the heart's truest victories are often invisible to the world, known only to God and to the souls brave enough to love truly. Brother Francis carefully rewrapped the manuscripts and the token, then walked out to the old Roman ruins where the willow tree still stood, now so ancient that its trunk required support from iron bands installed by caring hands. At its base, the stone shrine remained intact, though weathered by centuries of northern winters. As he knelt there in the fading light of St. Valentine's Eve, Brother Francis understood why this place had drawn 2 souls together across the gulf of centuries. Some loves, he realised, are too large to be contained within a single lifetime, too profound to be measured by conventional standards of success or failure. They become part of the landscape itself, as enduring as stone and as renewable as springs return to the willow's ancient branches. The tree stands there still, they say, marking the place where love learned to be patient, where duty discovered its proper relationship to desire, and where 2 souls proved that the heart's deepest conquests are often achieved not through rebellion, but through the kind of faithful waiting that transforms both lover and beloved into something greater than either could have become alone. In the end, love had indeed conquered all, not through dramatic gesture or romantic defiance, but through the quiet persistence of two people who understood that the greatest transformations are often the most invisible ones, written not in history books, but in the secret spaces of the human heart, as enduring as the willow tree, and as renewing as the flowers that still appear. Mysteriously, beneath its sheltering branches each February, when the world remembers that love, in all its forms, remains the most powerful force for transformation that humanity has ever known.